All right, welcome back to the final installment, and we're going to look at assessment of beginning ensembles. Number one, whenever you go through the assessment process, and I've tried to reiterate this all the way throughout, we have to go back to what are our goals. So just as a quick refresher, tone quality, performance fundamentals, music making skills, responses, and instilling value. So as we go through, we've spent a lot of time talking about, well, what do we expect with tone quality? What are our expectations? We spend time with expectations in performance fundamentals, music making skills, responses, and how we're going to instill value. Now, once we know where we want to be, then we have to figure out some way to measure it. Okay? And so when we're looking at one musical concept, how do they read it? How do they listen? How do they move? How are they playing? Are they composing with it? Are they improvising? Are they able to sing and chant? Once we have a comprehensive view of that musical concept, now we need to be able to measure each one of these areas. And each one of these areas, once we get a measurement that is working, that's valid, that's reliable, then we have to begin to compile that information and look at it as an educator and say, okay, here's where the holes are in the teaching, or here's where the holes are in the experience. We need to be able to fix that. Here are the strengths. So we're going to continue to do that, and we're going to enhance it by adding X. And you base all of your decisions based on the data that you are receiving. And then over time, that's going to lay the foundation for your program. In the immediate future, it's going to impact instruction. It's also going to address how you sequence information, how you sequence content, how you sequence their experiences. All of that comes through assessment. So looking at this in terms of, a lot of times we use the word goals and objectives on many different levels, okay? So remember that assessments, again, are designed from backwards design. Knowing what the end result is going to be and working our way backward from there, knowing where the students are, and then how we can measure that. Okay, so the way that our lessons, units, and course goals are all designed are based on that end in mind. So here are the questions that you have to consider when you go through assessment. Number one, how will you measure your intended learning outcomes? What types of assessments do you plan on using? And what I want you to do as we're going through this process is I want you to think of one assessment that you're probably going to use, and I want you to work on developing that. Okay, so let's go through the assessment process very quickly. Number one, and we've covered this ad nauseum, specifying the learning outcomes. If you don't know where you're going to end up, how will you know if you get there? Okay, that's the main question. Where do you want your students to be? What do you want them to do? What do you want them to know? Remember, we're looking at knowledge. We're looking at musical skills. We're looking at musical abilities. So what do you want them to know and do at the end of your course? Then your next step is to say, okay, if I know I want them to be here, there has to be some way for me to measure this and for me to document it. So you're going to go through the process of developing a fair, valid, and reliable assessment. Okay, now that might take time. The first couple of times you use an assessment, it may not work exactly like you want it to. So you have to understand that this is a tweaking process as well. As you work on one, you're going to be changing it along the way. Those of you that have been through my courses understand that I use a lot of rubrics. those rubrics that you get are different than the rubrics that the semester before and the semester before that got. Because as I collect more data, I realize where the holes in the rubrics are. And if it's not accurately telling me your performance, I have to somehow go in and adjust the rubrics to meet the needs of the students. And as more data come in, I have a clearer picture of what the rubrics are measuring, how they're measuring it. And in some cases, when I first got here, the rubrics I was using rubrics that were already installed, and they weren't measuring what I wanted them to measure. So I had to go in and completely change them. That's fine. That's part of your teaching process. Okay. So once you've designed the assessments, you're going to collect data over a span of time. Okay. This happens all the time. Now, this can be video data. This can be written data. This can be audio data, however you want to set it up, but you have to set up that collection. Okay, then you use the data to provide enhanced and specific feedback to your students. Okay, so the rubric itself, a lot of times, and you have to train your students to think about it this way. Students will look at a rubric and think of it as a grade. And I'm sure many of you have that experience where you go in and you say, okay, I got 4 out of 5. That's not entirely what you're looking at, right? So you're looking at, are they meeting expectations? Are they exceeding expectations? And here's what they're able to do if they're meeting expectations. Here's what they're able to do if they're exceeding expectations. You're not placing a number on there yet. Okay, that's evaluation. That's down the road. What we're looking at is, what are you able to do? And so simply looking at a rubric, we can circle and we can categorize where you're at and look at the entire picture. So this is where you have to train your students how to use the rubric. So they look at a rubric, rather than seeing a score, they need to see, oh, this is where I am a little bit short and I need to work a little bit harder. These are the areas where I'm excelling and I can continue to push the envelope, and what I'm practicing right now is working. So, but you have to train them to think like that. You have to train them to use these rubrics as specific feedback mechanisms. Okay? And then you have to add the enhancement to that by how you address those rubrics, how you go over it with them. Now, this may not be that every time you use a rubric, you sit down individually with each student. But when you complete a summative playing exam and you have a mixture of self, peer, and teacher feedback, you may sit down and you may walk through and have students discuss why did they score certain ways. And then I would walk through my process of, here's what I listened for, here's why you got the feedback, and keeping in mind that on those rubrics you can always add comments down below. And that's going to be really, really important, especially at the beginner level. I was talking about assessment on a global level, but when we're speaking directly with beginners, it's vital that we provide that specific feedback, that there is some way that they can see, feel, hear, touch the feedback. Okay, so we have to be very diligent and insistent upon that. Okay, then we document the data collected to demonstrate growth over a period of time. Over the course of the year, we're going to want to see that growth. We analyze the data to inform future content and instruction. Use the analysis and documentation to evaluate your student and your teaching practices. This reflective component is critical. If we don't close this into the feedback loop, then the assessment process breaks down. Okay, and then we use the results to advocate for establishment, expansion, or enhancement of a music program. So if you're needing an assistant, this assessment data is going to be critical. Okay, if you're looking to advocate for your program, this assessment data can be critical. All right, so this is the process. This is the process that underlies every single assessment. So now let's dig a little deeper. Let's get into, well, what does this look like in the beginning ensembles? Okay, we'll break it down into 5 easy steps: the activity, the measurement, the documentation, the feedback, the adjustment. Okay, that was the process before, simplified 1 level. Okay, so now 3 items specifically. We want to measure their knowledge, we want to measure their skills, and then their musical skills, and then their instrumental skills and mastery. Okay, those are the areas that we're looking at. Now keep in mind, we're already thinking ahead of time on our goals: tone quality, performance skills, musical skills. Okay, they're going to have this knowledge, this skill, and the mastery of the instrument as well. So those already fit into our goals. So we see how that aligns. How are you providing feedback, and how are they applying it? This goes back to what I mentioned earlier of you have to be able to provide them information. In order to do that, you have to have a clear definition of what you expect. And this goes before you even introduce the activity and the measurement to the students. You have to have a clear definition of what you're expecting. And this is also going to help you with providing feedback. It's also going to help you in measuring. Because if you don't clearly define what you expect them to do, there's no way that you can write a valid, fair, and reliable assessment. And there's no way that you can provide them meaningful feedback. Well, how do we do that? We do that by looking at, okay, number 1, definition of airstream, embouchure, articulation, resonance. So when we use those words, what do we mean? Okay, so defining that very clearly, okay, is going to be critical. If we can define it, if we can have a specific definition, now we can measure it. We can describe it. We can provide specific feedback, and we can have an effective assessment protocol if those our definitions are clear. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This is an example of diagnosing issues within your ensemble, and especially at the beginner level. How do you know an individual is playing with correct airstream? Okay, if you can define this, now you can go in and you can create a rubric that has descriptions of varying levels of expectation, varying levels of achievement. And if you can do that, the rubric becomes more reliable and it becomes more valid. How do you know when someone is playing with proper embouchure formation? What does it look like? What does it sound like? If a clarinet player is playing with a loose embouchure, I'm going to know because their mouthpiece and barrel pitch is going to be below F sharp. So I may be saying, well, you're playing really flat, but you're pushed all the way in. What's going on? Well, pull your mouthpiece and barrel. All right, now I know it's your embouchure is not firm enough. But instead of then saying bite down, now I've got to think about, all right, how do we move that embouchure around? You might see students playing out of the side of their mouth with brass players. You're going to see all sorts of weird things, but you have to know how that's all set up. And you're going to have to measure that from the very beginning. You don't want to get 6 months into a student learning how to play an instrument and realize that they've been learning wrong the whole time. Because breaking that habit is going to be detrimental to their growth. So you've got to assess this from the very beginning. You've got to know how to identify it. You've got to know how to remedy it. But the only way you can do that is if you know how to measure it and you know how to define it. What physiological components are involved in the process of articulation for brass instruments and flute players? Okay, so now as a teacher, you're going to have to know how to listen for that. But furthermore, you build this into peer assessment and teach them how to listen for it. Because when they're at home, they don't have you with them. So this assessment process is about teaching them how to practice as well. Describe how to correctly articulate on a reed instrument. If we can describe how to attack on a reed instrument, we can write that into a rubric. We can write that into a feedback mechanism. And then we can have other students listen and rate their own. And then we ask them the question at the bottom, how are you going to work on this? Now we're displaying critical thinking skills, and we're getting them thinking about that, and we're closing that feedback loop like we mentioned. But you have to spend time here defining all of this. Describe the sound of correct articulation. This goes back to word choice that I mentioned in the last video. You have to have clear and articulate descriptions. You yourself have to know exactly what you want to hear and be able to put it into words, and not just, well, I'll know it when I hear it. That's not good enough. You have to focus on getting an articulation clear of exactly what you want. You have to be articulate. You have to be specific. If you can do that, you can design a rubric that's going to be able to help with that. In terms of resonance and articulation, what are the most common errors you should listen for? Now, this question is going to help you predict. It's going to help you develop a rubric initially. And then that's going to change as your teaching style changes, because you're going to catch a lot of those issues early on, and they're not going to be issues moving forward, but that's going to open up a whole nother can of issues. Okay? So our legato and staccato articulations are note lengths. Okay, so then it becomes a question of tone quality and how you approach teaching this to your beginners. Okay, what are the pitch tendencies? Okay, if we know the answers to all of this, we can write better assessments. So spend some time, and if you need to print this page out and write down some thoughts, do so. But this will help. This is the level. Now, this is not exhaustive. This is one page and a giant document of body of sound that I have. Now, if you want more of these, you can always go to the directed listening module on 513, and you can download a good portion of these. I have not put them all out there, but I've put enough out there to get you started for you to think about what it is you want your students to be able to do. Okay, this is the way that you have to think about musical skill and musical knowledge and performing skills. Okay, so some quick questions. So closed brass sounds. Okay, when I hear a closed brass sound, the very first thing that everybody goes to is, well, we need to open your back teeth. I've seen students who look like they have a basketball inside of their mouth, and they're playing and they're still getting a closed sound. Which begs the question, it's not an issue of where your mouth is or tongue placement. It's a matter of hearing. Are they hearing the right pitch? Are they buzzing the right pitch? Because those two, if those aren't aligned, the horn itself is going to compensate and play the right note 90% of the time. And if it compensates and plays the right note, even though you're buzzing the wrong pitch, it's going to sound like it's stuffy, or that it's closed off, or that they're playing with their teeth clenched. And you're like, well, open up your teeth. And they're like, I am. And so a lot of times we don't spend time on pulling the mouthpiece out and seeing, okay, can they sing it back to me? Can they buzz it back to me? Can they put it through the horn? And then what you'll find is that when they learn how to match that and they get the buzz and then they put it in, it opens up that sound. Okay, so that's one to think. Flag clarinet, who is pushed all the way in, we talked about that a little bit earlier. If they're flat and they're pushed all the way in, I know then, okay, we need to pull mouthpiece and barrel. And if they're not an F sharp, that means that there's something wrong with the embouchure. And we've got to work on that. It could be a chin related issue. It could be loose corners. It could be where they're putting their teeth on the mouthpiece. There's so many different things that it could be. But now I've isolated it into their embouchure, as opposed to just thinking, well, you're flat, firm up a little bit. You know, now we can really get into why things need to work a little bit differently. Trumpet who cannot get above a middle G. Okay, so you're going to have students that struggle with getting what we call a high buzz. Okay, why do they struggle with getting a high buzz? Well, a lot of times it's the words that we use: tighten up, move air faster. So thinking about how do we change that? Okay, a lot of times we say faster air, and they just blow more air. It's not necessarily that it's faster, it's that they blow more air. Well, you can change airspeed with tongue position. Okay, so if they think E, you move the tongue up in the back of the throat, and it forces the same amount of air through a smaller space, which ultimately speeds it up. So you go from an oo getting a, if I go E, now all of a sudden I'm buzzing two different pitches, and I didn't change the airspeed. I didn't change the amount of air going through my lips. All I did was change my tongue position. So if I think E, A, oo. Okay, now I was able to go right down by just thinking E, A, oo, and keeping my airstream the same. And that's something that we would work on. Now, obviously, I'm going to work on that with mouthpieces, only because they're not going to have enough stamina and control yet to get the pitches to come out. You know, you're not going to be able to get them to go. You're not going to be able to get that. They don't have the control yet, but eventually they will, and you can have fun with that. However, you do want to make sure that you're focusing on that buzzing. Now, a fluid who can't make a sound on a head joint, 9 times out of 10, this is going to be too large of an aperture. Okay, so we're going to think, all right, why is that too big? Well, what I want them to do is I want them to think the word poo. So, and just say, before you say the oo, just let the air through. And it really focuses the airstream, it focuses the aperture, and they bring everything forward. And that helps get that first sound. Okay, those are the little pedagogical tricks. Now, there are many, many more that we could go over. But if I'm sitting there going, well, just faster air, make the air go over the tone hole for quicker. We're not giving them anything kinesthetic. There's no way for us to really assess that. So what I've done is if you go on to the modules on 513, I've also got a handbook. And in that handbook is a how-to starter guide for every single instrument, and pedagogical tricks, ways to assess what you're seeing, helping you define, getting you a head start on this assessment process. Okay, so spend some time looking at that that beginning band notebook. It's very, very helpful. Okay, one thing to think about during your early semesters is in tone, in time, in tune, in touch. Remember, we have to get them in tone first. If we can play with characteristic tone every single time, and we play the right notes at the right time, everything else will fall into place. If you're playing with characteristic tone, you will be playing in tune. If you will be playing with characteristic tone and in tune, you will be much more apt to play musically or in touch. So keep in mind that this is gradated. We have to get tone, then we play in time, then we play in tune, then we play in touch. Okay? And we have to have this general approach with our beginners all the way through our high school students. So here's some ways that you can begin to develop that. Okay? So looking at developing pulse within your ensemble. Okay? Because if we know that we're creating a great sound, we're also going to have to make sure that all of our notes are of consistent length, that we're shaping the notes the same, we're ending the notes the same, and that we're articulating the notes exactly the same. So here we talk about internalizing the pulse, shapes of notes. Okay, does every note start and end in time? Okay, it's not enough for you to just start and end together. You have to start and end together, but be in time, which is why it's critical when we go back to how we approach teaching beginners, that we have a time set aside for rhythm every day, that we have tonal work every day, that we have method book work every day. And the reason that we have to have each one of those is that we're having to teach them how to go through the process, that we teach them to play in time. Now, keep in mind, your rhythm work, your listening, your tonal work, all of that has to be within a musical context. Because if you're teaching it out of context and then trying to pull it back in, you're going to struggle with that transfer. So really make sure, excuse me, that it's clear. All right, so this side really walks you through that process. Okay, same thing here with fundamentals. I've also given you a hierarchy on this side. So when we're working with young students, when we're working with advanced students, when we're working with our top level ensembles, the first thing that we listen for is we listen for pulse, varying levels, some sonic events, encompasses many fundamental skills: breathing, articulation, airstream, release. All of that is focused on pulse. A lot of times we say, well, we need to be more aware of that phrasing. Well, a lot of times phrasing is not a question of them not being able to do it. Many of them are doing it. In fact, probably about 90% of them are doing it correctly. They're not doing it correctly in time, which means it's a pulse issue. So no matter how hard you work on developing that dynamically, it's not going to work because they're not all in sync. Okay? Body of sound, this gets into airstream, bow stroke, embouchure, grip, articulation, note length. Now we get into symmetry as the third level. So you can see it's a hierarchy of sound. This same hierarchy you have to build as beginners. Now, what's great about this, and why I include this in the assessment discussion, is because this helps you define. This helps you to sequence. This helps you to put it all together. This gives you the words that you need to write effective rubrics. This gives you the words necessary and the clear definitions necessary to measure students accurately and validly. So spend some time, read through this. So when we start now to develop these measurements, what criteria guide the assessment of student learning? Number one, knowledge, skills, techniques. That's what we're really going after. Assessing student learning, you're going to want a mixture. You're going to want self-assessment because you want to make sure that they're able to diagnose and prescribe themselves, because that's what they do at home. When you ask them to practice, that's what you want. So when you do practice reports, instead of how many minutes did you practice, now you can ask them to set a goal and then ask, did you hit that goal or not? That's one thing, but not, students are going to lie on their practice reports. It's like death and taxes. they're going to lie on their practice reports. They're going to tell you that they practiced 220 minutes because that's what you said they needed to get an A. Okay? That doesn't mean that students are deceiving. What that means is that since the dawn of time, students have never really practiced as much as they say they've practiced. Because then all of a sudden you're saying, we just worked on this yesterday. Why did you not remember it? Okay? So self-assessment allows you to see how well did they diagnose and prescribe. So that, going back to my original practice report thought, it's that if they can diagnose and prescribe, then my assessment is going to be of their practice. What did you work on? How did you fix it? And then I'm going to use that data for when I listen to their summative evaluation or one of their playing tests. And if they make the same mistake, then I'll be able to write a note. Well, you think about this. You did this originally, and maybe it worked a little bit, maybe it didn't. But now I can give them more specific and contextual feedback. Whereas without that self-assessment, I have no idea. I'm just shooting in the dark, which makes my assessment much more effective. And it's going to allow me to be more consistent and specific and accurate with my own measurement. Okay? And then we need to have peer assessments. They need to be able to listen to each other. By doing peer assessments and mixing that up, they're also getting to know what each person sounds like, and they're able to listen to what the different tones of the ensemble are going to be and how to identify that. And that's going to be huge when we start getting into higher levels of balance, blend, and all of that later on. But we have to teach that as beginners. And there are fun and creative ways to be able to do that. And that's part of the excitement of teaching, is coming up with those ways. But in terms of assessment, you have to have a clear definition of what you want. And then you can go in and you can try these different creative strategies to make it happen. Okay, so there are different kinds. There are formal and informal, formative and summative. Okay, formal meaning we're going to take time out of the day to have a test. Informal would be what we do on a daily basis, which is where we're listening and we're giving real-time feedback. Formative is going to be the assessments that we do along the way. Summative is going to be that very end. It could be a concert. It could be a final playing test. It could be chair auditions. However you want to set that up, that will ultimately function as a summative assessment. Okay, types that you can use. You can use checklists. We used to use checklists and playoffs all the time, especially with beginners. We would do it with scales. We would do it with, and there, I'm not always talking about the full 8. I might talk about the first 5 notes. You can play B flat to F back down to B flat with characteristic tone and clear articulation. And if they play it and they pass it off, then we're going to move on to the next. They're going to get a check mark, a gold star, a carrot. It didn't matter. I mean, they wanted to, and we would put challenges in front of them. Every week it would be something new, and they would try. And then they would come in and they play it for us. And yeah, we passed it off, and they would move on. Okay? All of that's built around trying to develop specific skills. Okay? Paper and pencil, this is for your musical knowledge, so that they have, maybe it's key signatures, maybe it's tempo terms, all of that. You're going to have some paper pencil. Performance, obviously, you're going to have like playing tests, and these are going to go beyond just the notes and rhythms. This is where you're going to be able to add more connection to musical skill. And through that, you're going to use rubrics and sometimes rating scales. I would highly recommend rubrics more so than rating scales, because rubrics provide more specific feedback. And they're going to allow you to focus your comments on more specific issues rather than trying to write out the areas that could be taken care of in the content boxes. Actions, playing tests, practicing peer and self-assessment. I've talked a lot about that. I just wanted that up there so that you had an idea of what all you could use. So the format, authentic, we could do portfolios, journal entries, recordings, playing tests, peer assessments, self-assessments, and so on. I've talked about a lot of different ways that this works. I also want to show what this looks like at the beginning ensemble level, okay? So this might be a rubric. So this is a string rubric, okay, where we look at wrist position. And this allows us to be able, now, if we had stand partners look, and group A warms up first and group B watches, the group B is going to be able to look at their stand partner and circle what each one of these look like. Tip a finger on the string, fingers first joint position, thumb position. Okay? Circle the picture of the appropriate skill level for each category. Now, when they submit a video to you, you have the same rubric, and you can go through and circle. But giving this is much more specific feedback than trying to describe it. Takes a little more time, but this is something that you can use, that your students can use, that your students can take home with them and practice. They can upload a video into the learning management system. Many schools are going to Canvas or Google Classroom. They can upload it, they can watch it, they can fill out this rubric, and they can submit it along with the video. Then you can go in and you can fill it out, and then you can add your comments to the bottom of it, and now it becomes a much more authentic and engaged assessment process. But this is what a beginning ensemble rubric might look like. Use pictures, because the pictures are going to be right up there with modeling. They're going to say more than any amount of words that you can put into these boxes. Here's another example. This would be if we were looking at beginning ensembles. Okay, posture, technique, breathing, and tone. All right, so I would want all of my students to be proficient. Well, if I know that I want all my students to be proficient, an understanding of posture but is lacking one of the areas of consideration. Here we've put all the consideration: feet flat on the floor, back straight, shoulders relaxed, edge of chair. Okay, hand position, position of instrument in relation to the body, economy of motion, attacks, and articulation. Okay, now what we might do is we might circle here, and then in comments, I'm going to tell you what I saw. I may go here, and I'm going to tell you what I saw. So now we can support what we find up here. This is being, and I would say this is for a beginning ensemble. So this is for students who are just learning the instruments. So you have to be a little more, the words are not always necessarily as clear as you would like them to be. You know, so in terms of, this is kind of counting areas, but we're able to give them a more clear definition down here. Okay? Now, here's a student self-assessment rubric. Now, with this process, they read it, and this is where you do stand partners, group A, group B. Group A warms up, group B listens. And they give feedback, and then now when they turn this in, I'm able to say, okay, can they hear it? What are they hearing? And what is the feedback they're giving? Which this gives me an idea of what they're hearing and how well they're able to diagnose and prescribe. All right? But the next layer of this, if you really want to push your kids to the next level, is you have it blank. And this is where you would say, all right, we're going to do posture. How would we describe good posture? And you haven't put a whole bunch of words on the board. It's like, all right, now let's make a sentence out of these words. Okay? So this is what we expect. Great posture every time. Now, what would be superior posture? What is better than what we just put here? And we describe it. And then what is, it's all right for today, but we could do better. And then what does bad posture look like? And then we're going to go in and say, okay, now what are we considering when we do this? And we write the considerations. And then we use that for a while. Get them used to it. Use it for a couple weeks. Then the next week, we come in and we talk about technique. We do the same thing. This is where that student-created rubric is going to add where it's assessment as assessment. Okay? So this adds a layer. This is something else you can do with your beginners that works really, really well. So in the end, with assessment of beginning band ensembles, and I'm going to move this down to here. With beginning ensembles, number one, you must clearly define what it is you're asking the students to do. You have to have clearly aligned objectives, and you have to make sure that all of that is spelled out and that you're regularly collecting data to show a picture of growth, a picture of development all the way through this process. So keep that in mind. Have the students engaged in it. Student self and peer assessment. And so you want a balance of teacher, peer, and student assessment, and you combine all of that data to inform instruction moving forward. Looking forward to seeing everyone in class. Best of luck, and we'll see you soon.